As I get my computer set up here, I would like to first thank the library for having me here this evening. But just as important, all of you who were brave enough to show up to talk about the bizarre history of Iliinois from the safety of wherever you're watching this program from. As you heard, my name's Chad Lewis, and I'll be your presenter this evening. And although my background is actually in the field of psychology, for the last 25 years, I've been traveling the world in search of the strange and unusual. Everything from hunting for vampires in Transylvania, looking for the Loch Ness Monster, crop circles, UFOs, weird people, odd places, you name it. If it's just strange and a little offbeat, I've traveled around the globe in search of these oddities. But what I discovered on my travels is that sometimes the weirdest things happen right in your own backyard. So that's what we're going to explore tonight, the bizarre history of Iliinois. For the next 45 minutes or so, we'll take a tour across the entire state, looking at weird and unusual history that you may not have heard of. Mostly, we're going to focus on the late 1800s, early 1900s as some of the most bizarre history that the state has to offer. And if you believe the rest of the country, Iliinois is a very weird place. You see, if you believe the rest of the country, you believe that they think Iliinois is strange in its own right. They believe everyone in the state lives in Chicago, that you're all crazy Bears fans, that you do nothing but eat deep dish pizza and drink old style. And even though this last one may be true, I'm going to be talking about a different side of the state, a more bizarre, a weirder, more fascinating, and a lot more fun side of the history as we explore some of the strangest stories that Iliinois has to offer. Again, anytime in this program, if you have a question, a comment, or anything else, feel free to throw it in the chat room. We will have plenty of time afterward for questions and comments. So what exactly are we going to explore tonight? Well, everything from bizarre deaths, ghosts, medical anomalies, all the way down to peculiar people and UFOs. I've also thrown in what I call keep in minds, things about the state you might not have known. For instance, in the time period in which we're talking about tonight, there were only about 4.5 million people in the state. Today, there are approximately 13 million people in the state, which means back then, they had a lot more room to spread out and be weird. And believe me, they took full advantage of that space. First category, bizarre deaths. Today, if you open up your newspaper and flip to the obituary section, you will probably see something similar to this. Old man Lewis died peacefully, surrounded by his loving family. No information, no details, no cause of death, nothing whatsoever. But in the era in which I was researching, I was finding a little different obituary because I was finding things like this. Suicide is gruesome. Whole top of his head blown off by the blast. Quite a bit different than dying peacefully surrounded by your loving family. And it made me think that people in the old days were closer to death than they are today. They often died at home. They'd have the funeral there, hence the term funeral parlor. But when we talk about weird deaths, don't feel too bad for these people. Because in 1900, the average life expectancy in the US was only 47 years of age. So when they died, they weren't missing out on a lot of life expectancy. And today, Everybody loves getting telephone calls, or at least those who are over 25 use the phone as an actual phone. But in the old days, getting a telephone call could be deadly, as evidenced by this case when a farmer dropped dead when he heard the report on the phone that his sister had been murdered. He was 65 and he dropped dead from fright or shock, had a heart attack. The craziest part of the story was that the story was wrong. His sister was alive, only to find out that her brother died over her false murder. But people that died were buried, but the few that were still alive were terrified of being buried alive. It was a huge fear in the 18 and early 1900s. And it's a great urban legend. It's great folklore. But is it anything more? Was anyone ever buried alive? Well, yes, we know thousands of people were buried alive. We know this because we have thousands of newspaper accounts from the late 1800s, early 1900s. Back then, whether you were in a diabetic shock or in a coma, doctors would often pronounce you dead. But lo and behold, many people, some of which were even at their own funeral, would pop up just in the nick of time to be saved from being buried alive. This may seem silly today with modern science and medicine, but our great-grandparents were so frightened of being buried alive, they came up with several inventions. My favorite was this. It's called a cemetery bell, and it does or did exactly what it looks like it was doing. It was a bell that would sit above your grave with a rope on a pole going down into your casket. So if you awoke in time and found yourself buried alive, all you'd have to do is tug that rope and it would ring the bell and alert the caretaker who lived there that you had been buried alive and they could come and rescue you. But there was one problem with this invention, though. On many nights, the wind would set these bells off, giving the caretaker quite a scare, thinking everyone had been buried alive. It was actually your responsibility after your loved one died to sit around their grave for several nights, making sure that they were truly dead, that they wouldn't rise up and come back from the grave. Right outside of Chicago is Mount Carmel Cemetery. It's world famous for being that final resting place of the little-known gangster called Al Capone. And even though Scarface is buried there, most people go here for this statue. And this woman could have used a cemetery bell. She's known as the Italian Bride. Her name was Julie. And back in the early 1900s, she, while giving childbirth, passed away. And as was the Italian custom of the time, she was to be buried in her wedding gown, which she was. And that's not the scary part. The scary part came that as soon as Julia died, her mother began having weird dreams in which the daughter came to her and said, "Mom, help me, dig me up, save me, I can't breathe, help me." So her mother did what any loving parent would do, petition the church and the cemetery to get permission to dig up her daughter. And her plan worked, except it wasn't right away. It took 7 years to get this permission. But she still dug up her daughter. And she was amazed to find that even though the casket was nearly rotted away, her daughter looked like she had been buried the day before. It was so creepy and so odd, they said, "Hey, let's take a photo of that and put that on the gravestone as well," which they did. You can see the condition of the coffin is not very good, but Julia looks like she was merely sleeping. Of course, once the story spread, it led to ghost sightings of a woman in a bridal gown all throughout the cemetery. She's now known as the ghost of the Italian bride. But if that's not creepy enough for you, how about a case of voodoo in Illinois? Here it came where a man claimed that this woman had been killed by voodoo because of all the ingredients found around her body pointed to her being killed by voodoo. Although her death certificate did not list voodoo as the cause of death. There are many cases of voodoo throughout Illinois. We'll get to one a little bit later in the program as well. But I'm going to move on from bizarre deaths. Not because I don't find them fascinating, I do, but because they're dangerous. I've discovered dozens and dozens of cases where people merely started talking about death when all of a sudden they dropped dead, as though the mere act of mentioning the Grim Reaper is enough to put you on its radar. So I'm going to move on to our next category while I still can. And that is ghost and haunted places. Now, just as a word of caution, some of you tonight in the audience are parents. That means you're not going to like this next case at all. In fact, those of you who are not parents will probably not like this next ghost case either, because it's one of the most horrific cases I've ever come across in all of my 25 years of research. And it deals with a place called Death Curve in Cambridge, Illinois. For decades, people claim that when you drove your car out to this rural area, once you came around the curve, a ghostly image of a woman with an axe would show up, chase you off the road, you'd crash and die, hence the name Death Curve. No one knew why the place would be haunted. But I started doing some research, digging through the old archives, and discovered that in the 1800s, early 1900s, a family did live out on this farmstead. They were called the Markham family. And in the early 1900s, Julia Markham went crazy. She snapped, went psychotic. She sent her two oldest and strongest children off to fetch water and wood for the day. When they were gone, one by one, she invited her 5 youngest children into the house where she took an axe and ended their life. When the other 2 came back, they were treated to the same behavior. Then, as all 7 of her children dead, she snapped out of it. Some spell she was under and realized what she had done. Then she tried to burn down the place with her in it. But neighbors caught wind of the fire. This is not her house. Literally caught wind of the fire and came over to see her rushing out of the house like a charred Freddy Krueger, where she died on the front lawn. Since that time, people going by have seen the ghostly image of a woman with a bloody axe in the road. Others claim that when you go out to the fence line where the farm used to be, you will see weird balls of light dancing along the fence line. Last time I was there, I brought my hatchet, hoping to entice her spirit out. Hopefully not to kill me. Luckily, she didn't, but to maybe conjure up her spirit. Others claim that when you walk back to where the farmhouse was, you will see what appears to be a phantom house start to appear. Legend is, if you go into the house, you will never return. Right down the road from the house is the cemetery where the children and the mother are buried. Many people who venture out to this rural cemetery report seeing and hearing the ghostly images of children playing in the cemetery. It is thought that they are the spirit of that mother and her children who are buried in an unmarked grave right here in the middle of your screen. A little bit closer to where a lot of you are watching this program from is that of one of the most infamous roads in all of Illinois, Munger Road. There are many, many variations to the legend of Munger Road, but often they talk about the railroad tracks. And the most commonly told legend tells of a group of children, whether they were in a van or a school bus, they came over the crossing and were struck by a train and died. Now they haunt the area where they met their end. One of the dares is that if you park your car and put it in neutral in front of the railroad tracks, your car will be pushed uphill over the tracks by the spirits of those children who do not want you to suffer the same fate that they suffered while they were there. Others claim to see a phantom train come down these tracks. They can hear the rumbling of the engine. They can feel the vibration. They can see the light. But the train simply never arrives. But if you're going to try this dare, be very careful. Years ago, this might have been a fun dare, but today the road is very, very busy. A lot of traffic. So do so at your own risk, because I would hate to have to put you in my next program as another spirit haunting Munger Road. Perhaps the most infamous haunting is that of the old Willowbrook Ballroom, which recently burned. Back in the 20s and 30s, this was called the Old Henry Ballroom, based on the candy bar. It was said that a woman was at the dance, a young girl by the name of Mary. And when the dance ended and cleared out, Mary was involved in a car accident on the way home. Whether she was struck by an automobile or in an automobile, we don't know. But since that fateful time, many people claim to have seen the vanishing spirit of a woman on the side of the road on Archer Avenue. There, usually at night, but not always, they would see a strange figure looking for a ride on the side of the road. Many know this as the vanishing hitchhiker urban legend. But in fact, people claim that Resurrection Mary haunts the road where she met her end. Many claim they've picked her up. Some even claim she'll take you to Resurrection Cemetery. Other eyewitnesses have seen her touching the bars. Some claim there's evidence of her singeing her fingerprints onto the bars. And of course, like all good legends, nobody knows the origin. There are many people buried in the cemetery that fit the description. They're either called Mary or some variation of the name, and they died prior or up to about 1930, because that's when the legends began. Some tell that bars along Archer Avenue would keep a Bloody Mary on the bar at night just in case Resurrection Mary made her way in from the graveyard. I'll leave it up to you to determine whether she's the vanishing hitchhiker out on Archer Avenue. I love this category. Today, we could probably explain a lot of these, but back then, they had no idea what was going on, including a story we're all familiar with, Sleeping Beauty, Walt Disney's rendition of the old story. Most people are familiar with it, but they're probably not familiar with Iliinois' version of Sleeping Beauty. Here's a young woman who was in a sleep-like trance for 108 days. And unlike Sleeping Beauty, she could not be aroused by her sweetheart. I tried to follow up on a lot of these cases, and oftentimes they were just one-offs. The newspaper would report on them and never give an update, so you'd never know where these cases ended up. Keep in mind, the zipper was developed in Iliinois back in 1890, just one of the many firsts that Iliinois is proud to call their own. Medical anomalies also were feared of people coming back from the dead, not only being buried alive, but people coming back from the grave. And not just in a fun, cool way like we see them today with all of our media shows and entertainment, but they thought in a creepy, weird, zombie-like way, including this case. It was 1910. It was announced at a church that one of its oldest residents had died. They gave the announcement all through the Methodist church. Well, you can imagine with their surprise when the doors of the church opened up, and guess who walked in? The deceased. You can imagine the surprise and the shock from many of the congregation that were there. It was another false story that the person did not actually die. Keep in mind, the average height of an American male during the time we're talking about was only 5 feet 6 inches. In fact, the largest person ever on record was that of Robert Wadlow of Alton, Illinois. He died while growing. He was just a wee bit short of being 9 feet tall when he died in 1940. They have a life-size statue of him in Alton. You can go there and see how gigantic he truly was. They have another one at Ripley's Believe It or Not Auditorium in Wisconsin Dells as well. I love this category because this category is the one where science says these things can't exist. Skeptics say they don't exist. Yet every year, people in Illinois were coming face to face with these mysterious creatures. Right outside of Effingham is the old Ramsey Cemetery. For decades, it's thought to be haunted by mysterious balls of light similar to these floating through the cemetery. Others claim there was an old chapel there where a young man took his own life at the end of a shotgun, and it was haunting the chapel so much that the townsfolk had to tear down the chapel to get rid of it. But that's not the scary part. For me, the bonus, not only do you get a haunted story, you get a little bonus as well. You'll see what I mean. Because in order to get to this rural cemetery, you have to drive down a series of back roads. And when you do, you'll see a bunch of caves indented into the landscape. Legend is, many people who look into the caves see something staring back at them. Something that couldn't be there. Something that shouldn't be there. But yet, there it is, staring right back at them. So what are these witnesses seeing? Well, maybe I better let you just take a look. This creature, for lack of a better term, they called a werewolf. Said it was the size of a bear, but shaped more like a wolf with the long muzzle and this deep, dark, matted down fur. But don't worry, you're not the only weird people to see werewolves. Thanks to my good friend and colleague, Linda Godfrey, my home state of Wisconsin is now known as the werewolf capital of the world. It began when Linda started receiving reports of people traveling down a small stretch of road called Bray Road. There, they would often see a similar creature to the Effingham monster. Again, this large fangs, huge claws, wet, matted, hairy fur all over its body. Sometimes it was seen eating roadkill or freshly killed prey. But the good news is that outside of charging at a couple vehicles, these creatures seem to be just as frightened of witnesses as they are of it. And rather than attack you, it seems more apt to simply scurry back into the underbrush and remain undetected. So the good news is, if you go looking for these creatures, whether it's on Bray Road or Ramsey Graveyard, most likely you won't be killed. Well, 50-50, do so at your own risk. The Big Muddy Monster in southern Illinois in the Murfreesboro area of Little Egypt, as it's called, is the home of a creature they called the Big Muddy Monster. The river got its name because it's big and muddy, so they called it the Big Muddy River. It was in 1973 when most people heard of the Big Muddy Monster. Two lovebirds were parked down by the river when all of a sudden about 11 p.m., this huge giant monster came up covered in river mud toward their car. They were so terrified, they scurried down to the police department, made a report, and the officers came back looking for this monster of the woods. One officer was so terrified he heard a growl in the woods, dropped his revolver, and refused to go back into the woods to pick it up. They found giant footprints. A terrible smell was in the air, and it set off international stories about the big muddy monster. Most people believe it's the start of the legend of the big muddy monster. But in fact, it was just another sighting. Here's a story back in 1949 talking about people offering a $100 reward for the capture of the big muddy monster. 1988, this gentleman, Bob, owned this salvage yard on the outskirts of town. He had an encounter with the security guard where they both saw this thing in the middle of the night. His security guard wanted to shoot it, but Bob said no. Bob told me, he said, "We don't know what this thing's capable of. If you shoot it, it might just make it mad and it might kill us." Stories still continue about the big muddy monster, but you don't have to take Bob's word for it. You don't have to take my word for it. You can take your own word for it and go to the big muddy river. Just don't swim in the river. You might come out looking like the big muddy monster as well. Here I am on one of my expeditions to Loch Ness looking for the Loch Ness monster. I'm the one in the blue without the really cool beard. Little did I know, if I wanted to see sea serpents, I should have stayed in the Midwest. Well, Lake Michigan, that is. For hundreds of years, people have seen something huge in the depths of Lake Michigan. Early pioneers talked about these giant leviathan of the deep in the lake. Newspapers were filled with hundreds of reports of people seeing something strange in the waters. One of my favorites came in 1900 when construction workers with their horse and their big cart were working near the water, when all of a sudden they saw some huge creature rise out of the water. They went to grab their weapons, their pickaxe, their equipment to come back to kill it because nobody would believe them. But as soon as they did, the thing descended into the water and was gone from their sight. Skeptics claim all these sightings are nothing more than schools of carp, or maybe animals that were lost from the circus, from Adam Forepaugh and others. But up to this very day, I receive reports of people who have seen something they simply can't explain in Lake Michigan. Keep in mind, Chester, Illinois prides itself as being the home of Popeye the Sailor Man. They have a Popeye museum there and a festival every year as well. We all love stories of witches, especially on the winter solstice, but they only happen in Hollywood, right? Well, Hollywood, or St. Omar Cemetery, up in Ashmore, the northern portion of the state. This rural cemetery is said to house the spirit of a witch who has haunted this rural area. The reason people believe she's a witch is because of her gravestone. You can see here her name was Carolyn, and they believe she was a witch because look at the date of her death, February 31st, 1882. It is very difficult to die on February 31st, even in a leap year. One of the legends was that witches could only come back and haunt you on the night that they died, the date in which they died. So if you suspected somebody as being a witch, you could put February 31st, knowing that they could never come back and haunt you. Others believe it was just simply an engraving error that was too expensive to fix. But I'll leave it up to you to go there and see if the witch is haunting the cemetery. This category, these stories were so weird, they didn't fit into any other category. So I gave them their own category. What about this story? Pet monkey is a suicide. The monkey's owner died and it refused to leave or eat until it was forcefully removed, and the monkey passed away shortly after. Many called it a suicide by the monkey, who loved its owner so much it joined him in death. And some of you watching this program are married, and without a doubt, you're all happily married. But if there's anyone who's not happily married, you may want to do what this next couple couples did, because they weren't happily married either. They were friends, so they decided to swap spouses, husbands to trade wives. Men agreed to separate and swap their wives with one another. Apparently, the article went on to say that all four were super happy at the arrangement. It was the best thing they had ever done. So again, if you're not happily married, maybe try this with one of your friends. What about this oddity of a man being run over by 14 train cars and only slightly hurt? They thought it was an act of providence, an act of God that spared him from being killed. Strange oddity. Keep in mind, Illinois was the first state to ratify the 13th Amendment. I love this story of gypsy on gypsy, well, swindling, if you will. Tells the story of a gypsy who claimed that a fellow band of rival gypsies, or the Roma people as they're known, swindled him out of $1,000. Went to the police and said, if you get my money back, I will not press charges. So they got the money back for him. Gypsies trying to swindle one another, and of course, the locals that fell victim to them as they traveled through Illinois as well. Must have been quite the sight to see these bands of Roma people coming through. Just the colorful characters and the uniqueness as they made their way through Illinois. Keep in mind, during this time, nearly half of the workforce was involved in farming. Today, that's less than 1% and shrinking every single year. Don't worry, you're not going to see any of your neighbors or in-laws in this part. It's too long ago for them. But Illinois has a long history of unique people, including the old original hobos that would ride the rails and hop the trains. They started their hobo conference in Illinois. They started it right outside of Chicago at the jungle where they all camped out. That's where they started their tourist union number 63, because everywhere they went, they would be arrested for loitering or vagrancy. But if they were a member of the union, they could say, I'm here looking for work. There were 63 hobos sitting around the fire at the jungle, so they called it the tourist union number 63. Every year they would have their hobo convention in Illinois. That is until the town of Britt, Iowa took them away over 100 years ago, and they've been having it in Britt ever since. The union is still going today, and the union will let anybody in who wants to get in. And when I mean anybody, I mean anybody. Here's my union card for being a member of the Tourist Union number 63. You can see the patch on my satchel representing that I'm a member of the Hobo Union. So if they'll let me in, God knows they'll let anybody in. Here's a weird case in Illinois. A man arrested for having multiple wives. He was arrested and sent to jail for marrying several different women in Illinois. He was sent to jail, heavily fined. He could have saved himself a lot of trouble and just swapped wives like that last couple did, and he would have saved himself some heartache and financial ache as well. Sometimes stories in Illinois weren't real. Well, they were real, just not accurate. Here's the story of the Woolly girl, claims she's out of Galesburg. But in fact, she wasn't from Illinois. She was from Minnesota. And she wasn't part sheep, part wolf. She was a well-known circus attraction, a freak of nature, as they were called back then, Alice Elizabeth Doherty. She went on to have a very good life as an attraction throughout the world, being a freak of nature. And she wasn't part sheep or anything else. She simply suffered from a genetic disorder called hypertrichosis, which people who suffer from it normally grow hair all over their face and upper torso. Back then, if that's what happened to you, you'd be usually put in a dime museum or on display as a freak. If you were lucky, your parents would allow you to run off and live in the circus and travel with people like P.T. Barnum from the Barnum and Bailey Ringling Brothers Circus, and later Robert Ripley from Ripley's Believe It or Not fame. And believe it or not, a lot of parents allowed their children to go and live with these men on the road because they knew they would make a lot of money and they'd have a much better life on the road than they would back on the farm in Illinois. At one point in time, P.T. Barnum and one of his freaks of nature, General Tom Thumb, were two of the wealthiest men in America for being a freak of nature. As you heard me state earlier, I'm from Wisconsin, and we've been known to have a couple weird people come from my home state. Many of you might recall Ed Gein, the butcher of Plainfield, Wisconsin. If you don't, they made many books and movies about his life, including Psycho, Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Silence of the Lambs, and many, many others. If you don't recall Gein, you can Google him. Please don't. You'll be cursing my name all night. We had Jeffrey Dahmer, the cannibal of Milwaukee. So we're known for our serial killers in Wisconsin. But neither of these men or any of our serial killers can compete with the Iliinois serial killer, H.H. Holmes. It was during the Chicago World Fair when Holmes built his hotel, his death castle. He had it built where he would have renters come in and then he would kill them and get rid of their bodies. Being that so many people, tens of thousands, were going to Chicago for the World's Fair, nobody would miss these people. You couldn't track them down. He had many people hired to build his mansion there because he would fire them so they wouldn't know exactly what he was doing. For years, a lot of the remnants of the buildings remained, and they offered tours of the places with H.H. Holmes, but the city has torn down many of these locations. Keep in mind, the average income in the family of four in the time period we're talking about was only $380. I should note they still have tours of H.H. Holmes that you can go on, walking tours and bus tours as well. Of course, once things get back to normal, that is. And I guess if that's your normal, going on a tour to H.H. Holmes. But many people have that macabre sense of adventure. Psychic phenomena. I love this category. Now, I deal with a lot of psychics in my business, people who believe they're intuitive, they have psychic ability. And oftentimes they tell me that we all have psychic ability. Some of us just haven't learned to use it like others. So let's put that to the test. For the next slide, I just put in a random image generator on the computer and took the first picture that popped up in a generator. So I want all of you to clear your mind and just visualize the first thing that pops into your head. And when I flip to the next slide, we can see if any of you were close. So hopefully you have it, whatever it is, first thing in your mind. And here's the image that popped up in the generator, a bike tire on the ground on the sidewalk. We'll see after the program if any of you were close, and perhaps we all do have psychic ability. Well, you have stories of voodoo in Illinois, as evidenced by the previous story earlier in the program. And then you had a hoodoo spell as well. And this tells of a hoodoo spell being cast. And it was done, they thought a evil spirit was sent after him by a neighbor woman. And this was very common. I have a lot of stories in Illinois where the cows weren't giving enough milk, or the livestock were dying, or the crops were not producing. And it was thought to be a voodoo or hoodoo spell. And hoodoo is another term for being cursed, that someone hoodooed you, they cursed you with magic of some sort. What about this gentleman? He found that his till was missing a bunch of money. He was entrusted with a bunch of funds, and he declared that he was counting up the money when a tornado came by and swooped up all the money and took it away. It wasn't his embezzlement, it was an act of God, a tornado blowing the money away. And we all worry, especially today. Maybe 2020 is the year of worrying, but I'm here to tell you it's dangerous. So much so, it drove this next gentleman insane. He could not forget the idea that he had stacked the grain in his silo the wrong way and that it was going to rot. And rather than restack it or redo it, he just kept dwelling on it. Then people in his friends and family thought that he was going insane. And in fact, he did go insane. He was brought to the insane asylum because he could not stop worrying about the grain in his silo. So those of you worrying today, whatever you're worrying about, you may want to take a deep breath and relax before you follow in the footsteps of this gentleman. The last category we're going to talk about tonight is that of UFOs, unidentified flying objects. Of course, skeptics claim the only reason we believe in UFOs, the only reason we see UFOs, is because of Hollywood. TV shows like The X-Files and Unsolved Mysteries, movies like Men in Black and Independence Day, that's why we see UFOs. Media has told us to. But what you'll see in these next few cases is that people in Illinois, they were seeing weird things in the sky long before Mulder and Scully were out there investigating. The airships, 1897. There were more sightings of UFOs in 1897 than any other year in the U.S. history. Thousands of people in hundreds of Midwestern cities would see these giant airships or craft flying over their town. They even was said to have taken a photograph of one of them outside of Chicago. If the photograph ever was taken, it's been lost to history. But many believe this is a sketch of what the photograph showed going over Chicago in 1897. And these airships, these mysterious lights, they continued. Here's one from 1909 in Peoria, talking about a conductor racing this airship for 12 miles before it put a lot of distance between it and the train. And trains were a great place for people to see these UFOs. Oftentimes the trains would be going at night and they'd have a great view of the night sky. Sometimes it was thought to be a war balloon or a premonition that something bad was going to happen. And these UFO stories happen not only as UFOs or aircraft, but also as will o' the wisps, these spook lights, these swamp gas that would appear all over out of nowhere. And people of that day were terrified. And it makes sense that people would see more things than we do today. As you saw earlier, nearly half the people worked outside, and people spent more time outside. In the summer, they'd sit out on their porch waiting for their house to cool off. If it didn't, they would just pull out a mattress and sleep in the front yard. So they spent more time outside than we do today. Just as a little piece of experiment, for the next week or so, mentally keep track of how long you spend staring at the night sky. And if you're like most of us, especially in the winter, it's not very long. Except tonight. Don't start tonight because with the planets coming in alignment, you may want to go out there and look this evening for the rare glimpse of the brightness in the sky. But as I'm running low on time this evening, this is what I hope you take from today's program. Because if you open your newspaper or you watch the news or listen to NPR or God forbid you consult the internet, you'll probably say something like this. Can you believe how crazy the world is? The world has gone absolutely crazy. And I agree with you. The world is crazy today. But hopefully this program shows you that the world was crazy 100 years ago as well. It will probably be crazy 100 years from now when they look back at us and wonder what the heck we were doing. So with that, if you want more information, my website has more than you could ever want or need at chadlewisresearch.com. But I hope your adventure does not end here with the program. Grab one of my books. Go on your own adventure of Illinois. And when you do, I think you'll discover that you live in one heck of a weird place. And I mean that in a good way. You're going to see things you've never seen. You'll meet some odd people. And along the way, you might just discover that the scariest thing out there is often yourself. So with that, I want to thank the library for having me here this evening. It's very rare to come to a program like this at no cost. So if you like programs like this, let them know so you get more of these. If you didn't like this program, let them know so you get fewer of these. But either way, they put a ton of work into getting me here, and they should be applauded for all of their work, because I can't think of a time in U.S. history in which the library has played a more crucial role than it does in today's world. With everything going on with the pandemic, societal issues, politics, libraries are the fabric that keep our communities together, a real treasure for any city who has one. So to show my appreciation, if you want to get any books from my website, type in the coupon code library. You'll save 20% off on any of my books just because the library is so amazing. So with that, I'll open it up. I'll stop my screen share. I'll open it up for any questions, comments, or stories from any of you.
Thank you, Chad.
There you go.
Okay. So let's see if anybody has any questions, you can feel free to type them in the chat, or if you just want to pop your video on and ask it. I know I have a couple. There's some things that stood out to me there. So I'll start off first, and I was wondering the one with a werewolf where people were seeing it in the caves. It seems like it was happening quite often. It wasn't just at night, right? Or full moons when werewolves are supposed to happen. And when you mentioned it was just kind of like acting like a regular, almost like a human, just kind of there, like they didn't feel strange or look strange, and they were kind of scared of everybody else. It reminded me of the kind of lore of like a Silky, with like putting on the different animal skin, and way it was kind of standing upright. I'm like, I almost wonder if it's a sort of like Midwestern Silky that had wolf skin, but it was almost like a person normally.
Yes. Outside of them being seen as bipeds, where a lot of people see them running upright on their hind legs, like you and I do, a lot of people have claimed that they thought maybe they were like shapeshifters of some sort, that it wasn't a flesh and blood creature 24 hours a day that was out there as a werewolf the entire time, but more of, like you said, throwing on the furs of the animal and becoming that animal. So people are amazed by that as well, even though people are terrified of it. You know, I have people claiming that their car was scratched or they were chased by it, but very rarely. As I said, most times these things want to try to avoid detection. So yeah, that's a great point. And I just, sometimes they're weird too. I just had a young woman, college age, tell me she was at a place called Terror Bridge in Iowa, where there are reports of werewolves as well. And this thing was running next to the car she was in. When the car was going 55 miles per hour, it was running like it wasn't even trying, like it wasn't a flesh and blood creature trying to keep up. It was just merely there. Weird stuff.
Ooh, that's creepy, especially with how dark it gets. I know, just driving, and I do appreciate you putting something from the Sycamore to Republican. I caught that little quote
Yes.
about them seeing a light in the sky. That's one of the oldest newspaper here in Sycamore. And
And I
just
think
another,
it, oh,
oh,
go ahead.
sorry. I was saying another thing I was wondering, we were talking about the people being out a lot, right? The farmers were 50% of the population, same as in Sycamore, probably higher than the 1%. And I was wondering, with people reporting to you, now that people are home, most are working from home if they can, have people's sightings risen because people are taking the time to look out or look up now?
Well, I certainly get a lot more haunted stories of people who believe their house is haunted, which makes sense. They spend more time there than usual. One thing that people often ask is, why, with all the technology we have, everybody has a camera on their phone. We have all kinds of game cameras or trail cameras set up. I mean, people have doorbell cameras. Why have we not captured more of these phenomena on camera? And that's the question. I don't know. It's, you would think that if these things were around everywhere and people were seeing them, somebody would have captured them. But on the flip side, unless you film it yourself, you're probably not going to believe any film that's out there today. So it's that catch 22, or it's the contradiction of it all.
Yeah, exactly. That reminds me of another question, but we do have a question from Glenna here. She asked, the bells over the graves struck me as very eerie. Do you have an idea how many there might have been in graves across Illinois?
They weren't very common, and most that were put there sometimes were only put there for a couple days and then removed, so they're not there now. Oftentimes they would be with the embalmer, and the medical staff would sometimes tie a little string around the toe of a deceased person with a bell, and they'd leave them there, and while they were getting ready for the burial procedure, and if it rang, they would know that something moved and they could check in. But these things weren't broad over the whole country. Every place had their own way of doing things. I did a program on bizarre burial beliefs, and after the program, a woman told me that their specific church always had the ritual of that before burying someone, they would knock on the coffin, and they would knock several times as they drove to the cemetery and listen for a response. When they got to the cemetery, they would knock again, listen, and then right before the casket was brought into the earth, they would knock a third time, and they felt that was enough chances for somebody to knock back to not be buried alive. So these things weren't universal. Everyone had different ways of doing it, but the cemetery bells were pretty rare at cemeteries.
It seems like expensive too, to kind of set up and rig everything. So I like how you're like, they kind of rented it from the embalmers or from the cemetery owners.
It was like in the old days, you would rent a cage that could go over your loved one's grave, so grave robbers and grave snatchers could not come and get it. But of course, you wouldn't want to pay for one yourself, so you'd rent that, and then when someone else died, it would go on their site, so they couldn't dig you up right away.
Grave robbing. See, does anybody else have any other questions? You can feel free to just ask it yourself or to type it here in the chat. That did remind me, with the stories of witches, and it seems like you're right. People have this big fear of witches, and for any reason, you can call someone a witch, or you can claim that they did something, right? That your cattle was missing, that there was a problem, that your hay had dried out too fast and you'd been cursed. And I wondered, because I saw some newspaper reports where it was like they actually brought it to court or to trial. You can't prove it wasn't that person being a witch. So what would usually be the outcome of these trials?
Well, most of them were done because obviously they were women. And in the old days, if a woman lived on her own, and especially if she was wealthy or held a lot of land, they were ripe pickings for being a witch, because oftentimes that person would be found guilty, or not even a trial, they'd just be killed for being a witch. And then the people would split up the land. It was basically a money grab. But oftentimes, yeah, it would be very difficult to prove that you're not a witch. How do you prove a negative? So it was very difficult to do that. And then if somebody came to your rescue and said they would vouch for you, it would be easy for someone to say, well, they're a witch too, and you're in cahoots together. So it was never ending. And there's so many people who lost their lives for being witches. And let me just state that witches were feared to come back on the solstice. They were one of the creatures that were thought to be able to come back on the winter solstice. Tonight is the night when many people feared that demons and witches and ghosts and other creatures could come back. In fact, the old legend was that you should tonight have a fire in your hearth or your fireplace all night to keep these spirits at bay. And if you don't have a fireplace, light a candle or have a light on the entire night so these spirits won't come after you.
Unless you want them to.
Yes.
Have a little fun on the solstice.
Yes.
Take some pictures, just get ready by the bed. Yeah, I like what you said about that. And I think I'm sure everybody here has seen something that you can't explain. And it's funny because you watch these videos, you're like, oh, what a poor video. Oh, you can barely tell what that is. It's so easy to comment on what somebody else has done. But when you're in that moment, I'm not thinking, let me grab my phone. I'm just like, what is this? How is this light moving this fast? What is going on? Like your body is just almost stuck and it's in shock. And then afterwards you're like, oh, all right, that just happened. You can't believe it.
You're right on. The overwhelming majority of people that contact me about a sighting, it's not a 20-minute sighting. It's very fleeting. So it doesn't even occur to them to grab their phone and do it. They're more studying what's going on. Disbelief, like you said, they can't figure out what they're seeing. And then even if they do get to their phone, for a lot of people, by the time they swipe it or put in their passcode, thumbprint, whatever, get to the camera, the event's gone. But most people that contact me, like I said, they tell me it didn't even occur to them to try to document it. They were just puzzled and trying to figure it out.
Yep. And then they have you and this other group of people. I mean, I'm sure everyone's heard of Reddit, where there's stuff you can't explain, right? And you don't really think about it until later on, and you get home and you're like, what was that? And you start researching it and you find you're not the only one that has these same stories. And I think that's the beauty of it. It's all over the world. Some of these lores and legends, they're coming over, even like the Greek gods, Roman gods. There are these same stories of creation, or these gods that did different things just across the world, because people need explanations, especially for stuff you just can't, even with science nowadays. And I didn't even think, but you're saying these poor people being buried alive, a diabetic coma. Like, it makes so much sense to us nowadays. And it's so terrible. I wonder how many hundreds of people, maybe thousands even, that had been lost before diabetes was really understood and diagnosed. And a short life, it's cut even shorter.
Yes.
Very, very interesting. Does anybody else have any questions for Chad right now? If you do see anything tonight, any demons, witches come to visit, please let me know. I will reach out to Chad. We can add it to our sightings list. And I love to put this on YouTube. When we have the recording uploaded, be sure to check our YouTube, and you can leave any comments of additional questions or any sightings that you have. Anything else that anybody would maybe want to share? Anything that they have some sightings about that they have questions over? Seems good. I'm not sure if anyone's typing in the chat. Okay, well, it is 8:06. So I'd like to thank Chad very much for his time today. I do have somebody commented, thank you. They really enjoyed your program. So I really appreciated it. And the time that you took to do, I know you have individual states as bizarre history, and you really did narrow down by state, and I really felt like it was very much about Illinois, and I learned a lot more of the areas near me and stuff I had already known. My husband grew up in Bartlett, so as soon as it popped up on the screen, it was like, oh, Munger Road, I know that. And it's just neat to kind of feel it, right? It's like, the more
Mhm.
people that learn about it, the more life there is to the legend. So thank
Yes.
you very much for your time. I really, really appreciate it. Sycamore Library is very great. Very grateful to have you. And I hope we can have you again soon with some more of your other wonderful lectures and talks.
Keep an eye out, everyone.
All right, take care. Stay safe. Light your fires tonight. Light your candles. Thank you, Chad.